The city of Academa was unlike anything the universe had ever seen. Floating high above the ravaged earth, it was a beacon of human ingenuity and spirit, defying the gravity of oppression and time. Towering skyscrapers, gleaming in the relentless sunlight of a distant sun, reached towards the stars. Suspended between the clouds, Academa wasn't just a city. It was a symbol of survival, of a human race that refused to surrender to extinction. Yet beneath this high-tech marvel, nestled in the heart of the city, was a neighborhood where old traditions still thrived, rooted in the deepest soil of African heritage. Kofi stood at the edge of a balcony overlooking his neighborhood, his hand gripping the railing. His skin gleamed bronze in the soft evening light, his eyes focused on the busy streets below. There was an energy here, an intensity, a buzz of life that spoke of resilience. The air smelled faintly of fried plantains and spicy stew, remnants of a culture that refused to die, even in the face of technological and political dominance. The sounds of drums echoed faintly in the distance, a rhythmic heartbeat that ran through the veins of every resident. At 25, Kofi had already become something of a legend. He wasn't a fighter by trade, but a leader, a voice of his people. His father had taught him the ancient ways, the philosophies that had kept their ancestors strong through slavery, war, and exile. Those teachings were etched in his mind, shaping his leadership style. But now, with a looming threat from a force far beyond Earth, Kofi would need to take on a role he had never envisioned. The alien forces were coming, and humanity's survival rested on the shoulders of people like him. He turned his gaze from the bustling streets to the horizon. The stars beckoned from above, distant and cold. His mind wandered back to the stories his father had told him, stories of distant ancestors, warriors and queens who fought not just with weapons, but with their hearts. He remembered one story in particular, one that had always stuck with him. The tale of a sword, an ancient weapon that had once belonged to a king. It was said to be capable of cutting through anything, even the strongest armor. But his father had always warned him, "Human hands can't hold this sword." Kofi had never understood those words fully, but they haunted him now. The sky above darkened as a ship, enormous and black, glided silently across the horizon. It was the size of a city, and its presence was as ominous as the clouds that gathered around it. There was no mistaking it. The alien queen was coming. Her race had long since conquered the stars, and now Earth was her next target. Kofi's father had always said that humanity's strength wasn't in technology or weaponry. It was in their unity, their culture, and the unbreakable bond of community. It was something the aliens couldn't comprehend, and Kofi would have to prove it. The footsteps behind him brought him back to the present. He turned to see Amina, his childhood friend and now a trusted ally, approaching with a look of concern etched on her face. "They're coming for us, Kofi." "The Queen. She wants to wipe us out," Amina said, her voice firm, but filled with an unmistakable undercurrent of fear. Kofi nodded, his expression hardening. "I know, but we won't go down without a fight. We never have. And we never will." Amina's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder. The weight of their history, their shared struggle, hung in the air between them. "Have you decided?" she asked quietly. Kofi hesitated. He had received the sword, the very sword his father had told him about, the one that had been passed down through generations. It had been locked away for centuries, but now it was his to wield. A powerful symbol, a powerful weapon. But could he truly hold it? Could human hands, his hands, master it? "I have to," Kofi said, finally meeting her gaze. "We all do." Amina's lips curved into a small knowing smile. "Then we'll stand with you, Kofi. All the way." As the ship loomed closer, its massive shadow casting a dark veil over the city, Kofi felt a stir of energy deep within him. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. This was a battle for everything that humanity stood for, its strength, its culture, its future. And he would be the one to lead them. The night air was thick with anticipation. The future had arrived. And Kofi knew that what lay ahead would change everything, if he could rise to meet it. The air was heavy with anticipation. Kofi stood at the balcony, staring at the black sky, his heart racing. He had expected this moment, but the reality of it hit him harder than he imagined. The alien fleet had arrived, and with it the overwhelming presence of their queen. In the distance, a massive shadow loomed, like a dark cloud that blotted out the stars. The queen's ship was unlike anything Kofi had ever seen, an imposing fortress of metal and energy, gliding toward the city with unnatural grace. It was a testament to the might of the alien race, a visual declaration of their superiority. As the ship approached, a strange hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground beneath Kofi's feet. He could feel it in his bones, an unrelenting power that seemed to crush everything in its path. The people of Akadema had heard the rumors for weeks, but now it was real. They were here. Kofi's thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind him. "She's coming." Amina's voice was tight with fear, but there was no hesitation in her tone. "The queen is about to land." Kofi didn't turn to face her. He couldn't. His gaze remained fixed on the looming ship. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? What did she want? Why now? "You know what she said, right?" Amina asked, her words breaking through the storm of his thoughts. Her exact words. "Human hands can't hold this sword." Kofi's grip on the railing tightened. The words echoed in his mind over and over. "I've heard them," he replied, his voice steady, though his insides churned with a growing unease. "But I don't believe it. We're more than what they think we are." Amina studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "What are we supposed to do, Kofi?" "She's not just coming to take our land. She's here to break us, our history, our culture, everything we are. And she believes she can." The weight of her words settled in the air between them. Kofi could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty. But he also saw something else, a spark. A reminder that the resistance, no matter how overwhelming the odds, was never truly alone. "She believes in the old lie," Kofi said softly, his eyes still locked on the ship. "That we're weak, that we can be crushed. But she doesn't understand what it means to be human, to be from here." The distant hum grew louder, filling the space around them. It was as if the very air was charged with energy, anticipating the arrival of something catastrophic. In the heart of the city, people had begun to gather. They watched in silence, faces filled with a mix of fear, anger, and determination. Akadema was a beacon of human strength, and they would not bow to an alien queen who thought they were nothing more than a primitive species to be subdued. Amina stepped forward, placing a hand on Kofi's shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone, Kofi. We're all in this together." Kofi turned to her, his eyes burning with resolve. "I never thought I was alone. I know what's at stake. This is bigger than me. This is for everyone, our ancestors, our future." The ship was now just moments away from landing. The ground beneath them began to tremble, sending waves of anxiety through the crowd below. People whispered to each other, trying to comfort one another in the face of the unknown. Suddenly, the ship's engines cut off, and the world fell silent. Then, as if in slow motion, the hatch of the alien vessel opened. A figure appeared, towering and regal, dressed in dark armor that reflected the cold light of the setting sun. The Queen's presence was undeniable, majestic, terrifying, and powerful. She looked down upon the humans gathered below, her eyes scanning the crowd with contempt. A moment passed, and then her voice rang out, clear and piercing. "You dare defy me?" The Queen's voice boomed, her words vibrating through the very air. "Human hands can't hold this sword. You are nothing." Kofi's heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve did not waver. He stepped forward, his voice strong, carrying across the gathering. "Human hands may not hold your sword," he called out, his words ringing with defiance. "But we hold something far greater. We hold our will, our spirit, our history. And you will never break us." The Queen's eyes narrowed, a cruel smile curling at the corners of her lips. She raised her hand, and the ground shook once again. "Then prove it," she said. "Prove to me that you are worthy." The challenge was clear. Kofi felt the weight of her words press down on him, but beneath it he felt a surge of something stronger, hope. He was ready. The resistance was ready. And they would face whatever came next, together. The air was thick with tension as Kofi stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The Queen's challenge had been issued, and the weight of it pressed down on him like the gravity of a collapsing star. He could feel the eyes of his people on him, the silent expectation. The alien Queen's words echoed in his mind. Human hands can't hold this sword. Kofi's grip tightened around the hilt of the ancient sword. The blade, wrapped in ceremonial cloth, felt strange to him. He had seen it before, passed down through generations, but never held it like this. His father had told him stories of its power, how it was forged by ancestors who had fought battles not just for survival, but for freedom. And now Kofi was meant to wield it against a force that had swept across the stars, defeating civilizations without a second thought. The Queen's figure stood at the foot of the ship, her presence towering over the city like a dark omen. Her gaze locked with Kofi's, the disdain in her eyes palpable, as though she found the very idea of humanity's resistance laughable. She made a gesture, and two of her soldiers, towering and clad in obsidian armor, stepped forward, dragging a heavy, glimmering chest towards Kofi. It was a symbol of her intent, an offering that was more like an insult. "Take your weapon," the Queen called. Her voice was smooth, mocking. "Prove your worth. Show me that you can hold it." The chest was opened slowly, revealing a set of intricate blades glowing with an otherworldly light. The air around them hummed as if acknowledging their presence. Kofi could sense the power in these weapons. They were crafted for destruction, for domination. They were everything humanity was not. And yet, the sword Kofi held, though its origins were ancient, was not to be underestimated. His fingers hesitated for a moment before he pulled back the cloth, revealing the sword in full. The blade shimmered in the light, but there was something different about it, something that resonated with his very soul. The handle, decorated with intricate carvings of ancestral warriors, seemed to pulse in his hand. For a moment Kofi felt connected to those long-dead fighters, as though they were speaking to him through the blade, urging him forward. The Queen watched him with an amused smile. "Do you think your ancestors can help you now?" she sneered. "Do you think that their strength will make you worthy of this fight?" Kofi didn't answer right away. His focus remained on the sword. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a piece of his heritage, a symbol of his people's strength. In that moment, he knew he wasn't just standing there to face the Queen. He was standing for all the generations who had fought for the survival of their culture, their identity. "I don't need my ancestors to fight for me," Kofi finally said, his voice steady and strong. "But I carry their spirit with me, and it will guide me." The Queen's lips curled into a mocking grin. "We'll see about that," she said, raising one hand. The air seemed to crackle, charged with the intensity of her presence. The ground beneath them trembled again, and Kofi's eyes narrowed. The challenge was clear. It wasn't enough to hold the sword. He had to prove that humanity could hold its ground against an unstoppable force. His fingers tightened around the hilt, feeling the sword shift slightly as if responding to his resolve. The ancient weapon was more than just a physical object. It was an extension of who he was, who his people had always been. In that moment, he felt a surge of power rise within him, a deep, unshakable strength. The Queen stepped back, giving a slight wave of her hand, and suddenly her soldiers moved. With inhuman speed, they were upon Kofi, their own weapons drawn and glowing with an eerie light. The challenge had begun. Kofi's breath slowed as he adjusted his stance. His mind was clear now, the doubt slipping away like mist in the morning sun. The sword was no longer just an artifact. It was a tool of defiance, a symbol of everything humanity stood for. He would not falter. With a deep breath, he swung the sword, feeling the weight of it shift as it cut through the air. The soldiers, anticipating his move, responded with speed and precision, but Kofi's resolve was sharper than any blade. He parried, blocking their strikes with a fluidity that surprised even him. For a brief moment, the battlefield seemed to slow down. Kofi's every move was instinctual, guided by something deeper than just physical training. It was his heritage, the pulse of 1,000 ancestors coursing through him. Each strike he made was a declaration. not just of his own strength, but of the strength of every human who had ever resisted oppression. As the soldiers stepped back, momentarily taken aback by his speed and precision, Kofi could feel the Queen's gaze upon him, now a little less confident, a little more wary. "You're stronger than I thought," the Queen said, her voice tinged with surprise. "But it will take more than that to defeat me." Kofi stood tall, the sword still gripped tightly in his hand. "You haven't seen anything yet." The days following the confrontation with the Queen were filled with uncertainty, but also determination. Kofi spent every waking moment in preparation, training both physically and mentally. He knew the path ahead would be long and grueling. The Queen's challenge had been just the beginning. The real fight was yet to come, and Kofi needed to be ready. The weight of the sword in his hand was no longer unfamiliar, but mastering it would take more than mere strength. It would require patience, discipline, and a deep understanding of its true power. The ancient weapon hummed softly in his grasp as Kofi practiced in the small private courtyard of his home. The sound was almost like a whisper, as if the sword itself was alive, calling to him. Each swing felt different, each movement sharper, more fluid. There was a rhythm to it, a dance, and Kofi began to feel the connection to his ancestors that his father had spoken of. This wasn't just about fighting, it was about honoring the past, carrying it into the future. Amina was his most frequent training partner, and over the past few days, their sessions had become more intense. At first, Kofi had struggled to match her speed. Amina was agile, quick on her feet, always one step ahead. But now Kofi felt his body responding to the rhythm of the sword. He began to anticipate her movements, his reflexes sharp and his strikes more decisive. "You're getting better," Amina said one morning, her breath heavy as she adjusted her stance. "You're starting to move with the blade, not just against it. It's like the sword is guiding you." Kofi nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "It feels like that. It's hard to explain. But it's like I'm not alone when I hold it." She gave him a sideways glance. "You never were alone, Kofi. You just have to remember that. Your ancestors, your people, they're with you." He paused, considering her words. It wasn't just about the sword. It was about who he was, who they all were, their resilience, their history, everything that had brought them this far. He could feel that strength growing inside him, like a fire kindling in the pit of his stomach. As the days passed, Kofi's training became more focused. He began to incorporate the teachings of his ancestors into his combat. His father had told him that every movement in battle had meaning, that each strike carried the weight of history. Kofi wasn't just learning to fight, he was learning to channel the spirit of his people into every action. But it wasn't all physical. Kofi spent hours each day meditating, sitting in silence, allowing the stories of his ancestors to fill his mind. He envisioned their battles, their struggles, their victories and defeats. He could almost hear their voices, urging him forward. In those moments, he wasn't just preparing for battle, he was preparing his soul. He was becoming one with the legacy of those who had fought for freedom, for identity, for survival. It was during one of these sessions that Kofi felt something shift. As he sat in stillness, the sword beside him, he suddenly felt an overwhelming surge of power, a warmth that spread from his chest to his fingertips. The sword seemed to hum louder now, vibrating with an energy that Kofi could almost touch. He reached for it instinctively, his fingers brushing the hilt. As his palm made contact, a vision flooded his mind, an image of his ancestors standing together, defiant in the face of overwhelming odds. Their eyes were fierce, filled with determination, just like his own. They weren't just warriors, they were survivors, carriers of a legacy that no alien queen could erase. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, but the strength it left behind lingered. Kofi stood up, a new clarity in his eyes. The path was no longer unclear. He knew what he had to do, and he knew that he could do it. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for all of humanity, for the culture that had been passed down to him, and for the future that he and his people would shape. When Amina joined him later that day, he was already preparing for the next phase of their training. She saw the change in him immediately, the confidence in his posture, the fire in his eyes. "You're ready," she said simply. Kofi smiled, his grip tightening on the sword. I don't think we ever truly stop getting ready, but I'm as ready as I'll ever be. Amina nodded, stepping into position. Then let's keep going. We'll need everything we've got. Kofi raised the sword high, feeling its power surge through him once again. He wasn't just a man holding a weapon. He was a link in a chain that stretched back through generations, and with each strike, each movement, he was one step closer to fulfilling his destiny. The day arrived faster than Kofi had expected. Standing before the gates of Academa, he could feel the weight of the entire city's hopes pressing down on him. The skies above had darkened in the past few hours, an ominous sign of the Queen's arrival. Her presence loomed like a storm, both literal and metaphorical, casting a long shadow over the city. As the ground trembled beneath his feet, Kofi's mind was clear, focused. He was ready. He had trained relentlessly, harnessing the power of the ancient sword, drawing on the wisdom of his ancestors. But now, facing the Queen once more, Kofi understood that this encounter would test him in ways he had yet to imagine. This was no longer just about strength, it was about leadership, about representing all of humanity's resilience, and about proving that they could fight back against an overwhelming force. Amina stood beside him, her face set with determination. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence was enough. They had come this far together, and now they would face this final challenge side by side. The Queen's ship descended slowly, casting a deep shadow over the city. The sight of it filled Kofi's chest with a cold, tightening feeling, but he didn't let it show. He had to remain calm, focused. The alien forces had invaded humanity's space before, but now it was time to turn the tide. They would not go quietly into the night. They would stand and fight, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The hatch of the Queen's ship opened with a hiss, and the air around them seemed to freeze. Kofi took a step forward, raising the sword high above his head, his eyes locked on the dark silhouette descending from the ship. The Queen herself emerged, towering and formidable, her presence sending a chill through the gathered crowd. Her eyes glowed with an eerie light, filled with an almost mocking amusement as she looked upon Kofi. "So this is the human who dares to defy me," the Queen said, her voice low and full of disdain. "I must admit I expected more from your species, but it seems that even your greatest warriors are nothing but children playing at war." Kofi didn't flinch. He had heard this before. The Queen's arrogance was her weakness. He knew this would be a battle of wills, just as much as a battle of strength. "I am not here to play," Kofi said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension like the blade in his hand. "I am here to show you that humanity is not what you think it is. We are not your prey. We are survivors." The Queen's lips curled into a smile, one that could have been mistaken for amusement if it wasn't so venomous. She raised one hand, and the ground shook beneath them. "Survivors? Your people have no idea what true power is. I've crushed entire civilizations, and you—" She paused, her eyes narrowing. "You are nothing." Kofi felt the surge of energy from the sword once again, a hum deep within his bones, a connection to the past and future intertwined. He took another step forward, his grip tightening. This was it. This was the moment where everything would change. "We are more than nothing," Kofi said, raising his voice for all to hear. "And you will learn that soon enough." The Queen's laughter rang out, a sound that felt like ice scraping against stone. "You think your sword will protect you? It is just a relic, a symbol of a bygone age. It has no place in the future." But Kofi did not waver. The sword was not just a relic. It was the heart of his people, the embodiment of their struggle, their survival. It was not the weapon that mattered. It was what it represented. And that the Queen could never understand. With a swift motion, the Queen raised her own weapon, a dark, shimmering blade that seemed to absorb the light around it. The ground trembled again as her soldiers took their positions, their weapons raised, ready for the first strike. Kofi's breath slowed, his focus narrowing to the Queen and her soldiers. He knew that this was only the beginning. They would fight, and he would prove to them that the power of humanity was more than just brute strength. It was something deeper, something they could never take away. "Prepare yourself," Kofi muttered to himself, his heart pounding in his chest, not out of fear but out of an overwhelming sense of purpose. "I won't back down. The Queen's smile faded, replaced with a look of cold determination. She was not going to give in easily, and Kofi knew that the battle ahead would push him to his limits, but he was ready. For his people, for his ancestors, and for the future. This fight was not just about defeating an enemy, it was about claiming a future for humanity, a future where their strength, their spirit, and their legacy would not be erased. Kofi stood tall, the sword firmly gripped in his hand, but inside, a storm raged. He could feel the weight of his people's hopes pressing down on him, the responsibility of leading them, of proving to the Queen and her soldiers that humanity was not a species to be underestimated. But as the Queen's mocking words echoed in his ears, doubt crept in, insidious and persistent. "You are nothing." Her voice seemed to ring louder than the clamor of the crowd around them, and for a fleeting moment, Kofi felt himself falter. What if she was right? What if, in the grand scheme of the universe, humanity was just a blip, insignificant, small and fragile? After all, they were still rebuilding after centuries of war and oppression. Could they truly stand up to a species that had destroyed countless civilizations? He shook his head, forcing the thoughts away. No, he couldn't afford to think like that. His ancestors had fought too hard, bled too much for him to give up now. This wasn't just his fight. It was the fight of every person who had ever been oppressed, every person who had ever faced overwhelming odds and survived. But the weight of the sword in his hand felt heavier now. Kofi's grip tightened, his knuckles white as he forced his thoughts to center. The sword was more than just metal. It was a symbol, a weapon of hope, a link to everything that had come before him. The strength of his ancestors surged through him, pushing back the fear, the doubt. He had a purpose. He had a reason to fight. The fight wasn't about him. It was about something greater, something that the Queen could never understand. Amina's voice cut through the turmoil in his mind. "Kofi, focus. Don't let her words get to you. You know who you are." "We know who we are." He turned toward her, her eyes full of resolve, and in that moment, he saw not just the woman who had stood by him since childhood, but the embodiment of everything he was fighting for. Their shared history, the culture they carried with them, and the legacy of strength that bound them together. It wasn't just the sword that gave them power, it was their unity. They were not alone. "Thanks, Amina," Kofi said softly, his voice steady again. "I needed that." She nodded. "We all need each other, Kofi. We've been through too much to let one alien queen tell us who we are. You've trained for this. Now you have to believe in it." Kofi took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, feeling the tension start to leave his body. His ancestors' voices were no longer distant echoes. They were inside him, guiding him. He raised the sword, its weight now familiar, its hum resonating with his heartbeat. He wasn't alone. The sword wasn't a symbol of isolation, it was a symbol of unity. As he turned back toward the Queen, the thoughts of doubt faded entirely. He had nothing left to prove to her. This wasn't about showing her his strength. It was about proving to himself and to humanity that they were worth fighting for. "You speak of power," Kofi called out, his voice strong now, his doubts forgotten. "But power is not just about destroying. It's about resilience. It's about surviving against everything that tries to crush you and still standing tall." The Queen's smirk faltered just for a moment. "Resilience?" she scoffed. "You speak as though your will can stand against the cosmos. But I am the cosmos. You are nothing." Her words stung, but Kofi didn't flinch. Kofi. He had heard worse from his own people, from those who told him that their culture, their history, had no place in this new world. He had heard those voices, but he had learned to silence them with his own. "No, you are wrong," Kofi said, his eyes fierce. "Humanity has always found a way to survive. And no matter how powerful you think you are, you will never break us." The Queen's eyes narrowed, her expression darkening. She had expected defiance, but this was different. This was something she hadn't anticipated. The unyielding spirit of a species that had clawed its way through the darkness to survive. Kofi's heart raced, but it wasn't from fear. It was the thrill of knowing that he was right where he needed to be. This was his purpose. And with every word, with every swing of the sword, he was cementing it. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for his people, for every voice that had ever been silenced, for every culture that had ever been pushed aside in the name of conquest. This battle wasn't just about a sword. It was about everything humanity had fought for, and everything they would continue to fight for. He was ready. And the Queen, for all her power, would soon realize that the strength of humanity was something she could never truly defeat. The battle raged on, but Kofi couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air, thick with tension, seemed to carry whispers, faint, uncertain voices among the resistance. He had felt the unrest for days, the subtle shifts in energy, but hadn't fully understood what it meant until now. He was in the middle of a strategy meeting when one of his trusted commanders, Jamar, walked in. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed with something Kofi couldn't quite place. "Kofi, we need to talk," Jamar said, his voice low, almost urgent. Kofi looked up, sensing the gravity in Jamar's tone. "What's going on?" There's something you need to know," Jamar hesitated, glancing around the room, as if expecting someone to be eavesdropping. "Some of our people, they've been speaking to the Queen's emissaries. They've been negotiating a deal." The words hit Kofi like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean negotiating? With them? Why?" His voice, usually steady, cracked slightly with disbelief. Jamar lowered his gaze. "They believe that if we surrender, if we offer something in exchange, the Queen might spare us. They think we're too weak to win this fight. They're willing to compromise, Kofi. They're willing to betray everything we've fought for." Kofi's heart pounded in his chest. Betrayal, the word seemed to echo, reverberating in his mind, drowning out the voices in the room. He could hardly believe it. The resistance, the very people who had stood by him since the beginning, were willing to abandon their cause for self-preservation. How could they do this? How could they forget everything they had worked for? His eyes narrowed as he looked at Jamar. "Who are they? Who's behind this?" Jamar hesitated before answering. "I'm not sure yet, but there are whispers. I've heard names, faces in the shadows. Some of the higher-ups, they've been in contact with the Queen's forces. They want to negotiate their own safety, Kofi. They want to leave the rest of us to fight alone." Kofi felt the floor beneath him tilt. He couldn't process the betrayal. How could they not see the bigger picture? The Queen wouldn't spare anyone. She had come to wipe them out, to erase their culture, their history. There was no deal, no compromise, only extinction. "Damn them," Kofi muttered under his breath. "How could they betray everything we've worked for?" Amina, who had been standing by silently, stepped forward. "Kofi, this isn't the time to let rage control you. We need to act. We need to find out who's behind this and stop it before it's too late." Kofi's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he fought to control it. This wasn't just about personal betrayal. It was about the future of their people. If they allowed the Queen's agents to weaken them from within, all would be lost. "You're right," Kofi said, his voice low but firm. "We can't let this destroy us. I'll handle this, but we need to be careful. The Queen wants us to fall apart, and this is exactly how she would do it. She'll play on our fear, on our doubts. We can't let her." Amina nodded. "We'll find the traitors, Kofi, but we need to be smart. We can't let them divide us." Kofi took a deep breath, pushing down the surge of anger that threatened to overtake him. Betrayal hurt, but this wasn't just about his feelings. It was about the future they had to protect. "Then we move quickly," Kofi said, his voice firm with resolve. "We expose the traitors, but we don't let this derail our fight. We keep our focus. We fight for each other. And we fight for what's right." The room was silent for a moment as the weight of Kofi's words settled in. Everyone knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about one man or one betrayal. It was about the survival of humanity, the survival of their culture. Kofi knew that if they didn't act fast, the internal rot could destroy everything they had worked for. "I'll find out who's behind this," Kofi continued, his voice now a quiet, determined whisper. "And when I do, they'll answer for it. Amina's hand on his shoulder was a reminder that he wasn't alone. They were all in this together, no matter the betrayal, no matter the odds. As Kofi looked around at the faces of his comrades, he felt a surge of determination flood his chest. The resistance was not just a group of individuals, it was a family, bound by their shared struggle and their unwavering will to survive. And no traitor, no matter how powerful or persuasive, would tear them apart. The days after the meeting were heavy with uncertainty. Kofi could feel the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The betrayal within the resistance had fractured their unity, and he knew that time was running out. But it wasn't just the traitors inside their ranks that worried him. There was something more, something deeper at play that he had yet to fully understand. His mind constantly returned to the Queen's words during their last encounter. "Human hands can't hold this sword." The phrase echoed in his mind, a riddle that seemed to taunt him. What did she really mean by that? Why had she singled out humanity's hands, their strength, their very essence? There was something more to her words, something Kofi had to uncover. One evening, Kofi found himself alone in his quarters, the soft glow of a single lantern casting shadows on the walls. His fingers traced the ancient markings on the sword's hilt, the very sword he had trained with for so long. He could feel its power, a faint hum that reverberated through his bones. But there was more to this blade than just its weight or its sharpness. It was a connection, an anchor to his past, his people, and a legacy far greater than any battle. Amina entered, her face tight with concern. "Kofi, you've been distant. What's on your mind?" Kofi glanced up, his eyes troubled. "I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something critical. There's more to this fight than just winning. It's not just about beating the Queen. It's about understanding what she really wants." Amina stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "You think there's more to her than what we've seen? That she's playing some deeper game?" Kofi nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about what she said, about the sword. She doesn't just want to conquer us, she wants to erase something that goes beyond the physical war. And I think we've been so focused on the fight that we've missed the bigger picture." Amina was silent for a moment, considering his words. "You think there's something about the sword? Or about us, that she fears?" Kofi didn't answer immediately. He couldn't shake the feeling that the sword, the resistance, and everything they were fighting for was somehow connected to something even larger than their current battle. "I don't know yet, but I think the sword is the key. There's a reason it was passed down through generations. There's a reason my father wanted me to have it." He stood, moving toward a table where maps and old texts were scattered. He had spent hours poring over these documents, searching for anything that might give him a clue about the Queen's true intentions. But it wasn't until he picked up an old journal, his father's, that he found something that caught his attention. The pages were yellowed with age, the writing delicate and precise. As Kofi flipped through, he came across a passage that made his heart race. "The sword is not merely a weapon of war, but a symbol of resistance. It is forged from the core of the earth, imbued with the spirit of those who fought for freedom. It is said that only those with true strength of spirit can wield it. It is not a tool for destruction, but for preservation, a key to the survival of our people." Kofi felt a chill run down his spine. The sword, his father had always spoken of it with reverence, but he had never explained it in such terms. A key to the survival of our people. Amina leaned over his shoulder, reading the passage aloud. "This doesn't make sense. Why would the Queen want to destroy something like this?" Kofi's mind raced. A key to the survival of our people. It wasn't just about the sword, it was what it represented. The Queen wasn't just trying to conquer them, she was trying to destroy their very essence, their connection to the past, to their survival. This wasn't a fight for dominance, it was a fight for their identity. Kofi slammed the journal shut, his mind made up. "I have to know more. There's a reason she's afraid of us. And if we can unlock the truth of what that sword means, we can turn the tide of this war." Amina nodded, understanding the gravity of the discovery. "So, what do we do now?" Kofi looked up, determination burning in his eyes. "We go back to the roots. We dig deeper into our history, into everything that made us who we are. The sword isn't just an object, it's a living symbol, and I believe it holds the key to defeating her. For the first time in days, Kofi felt a surge of hope. The battle ahead would be harder than ever, but now he understood that this fight was not just for survival, it was for the preservation of everything they stood for. The sword, his people, their history, these were the true weapons against the Queen's power. Amina squeezed his shoulder. Then let's get to work. Together, we'll find the truth. And so, with newfound purpose, Kofi and Amina set out to uncover the truth behind the sword, and the reason why the Queen had come to destroy them. The tension in the air was palpable, as Kofi, Amina, and the rest of the resistance worked tirelessly to unite the various tribes scattered across the planet. Each tribe held its own traditions, beliefs, and customs, some of which had been shaped by centuries of struggle and survival. But in this moment, there was no room for division. Kofi knew that in order to stand a chance against the Queen and her vast army, they would have to come together, not just as a military force, but as one people, united by their shared history and the strength of their ancestors. The journey was not easy. Some tribes were skeptical, unwilling to trust the others. Generations of mistrust had built invisible walls between them, walls that were difficult to tear down, but Kofi was relentless, and Amina was by his side, pushing forward with a vision of unity that refused to be shattered. Kofi stood before the gathered leaders of the tribes, their faces etched with centuries of wisdom and wariness. The leaders sat in a circle, each one draped in traditional garb, symbols of their power and identity. Kofi took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the faces before him. These were the people who had the power to change the course of history. But first, they had to be convinced that their fates were intertwined. "We are all here because we know what is at stake," Kofi began, his voice steady, yet filled with an undeniable urgency. "The Queen has come not just to conquer, but to erase us, to erase everything we stand for. Our cultures, our stories, our survival. She wants to wipe it all out." There was a murmur among the leaders, some nodding in agreement, others uncertain. Kofi pressed on. "This is not just about your tribe or mine. This is about all of us. We are stronger together, united by our past and our future. We cannot afford to remain divided. If we do, we will be picked off one by one, until none of us are left. We fight not only for our survival, but for the legacy of those who came before us. For the ones who fought to preserve who we are." Amina stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. "Kofi is right," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This is our moment. The Queen may think we are weak, but she underestimates the strength of our unity, the strength of our culture. We are not just warriors, we are survivors. And together we are unstoppable." The room fell into a heavy silence as the leaders exchanged looks. It was clear they were all weighing the risk. The decision to join forces wasn't an easy one. Trust had to be earned, and Kofi and Amina knew they had little time to build that trust. Finally, the leader of the first tribe, an elder with graying hair and weathered skin, stood. His eyes were sharp and his posture strong despite his age. "You speak of unity," he said, his voice heavy with suspicion. "But how do you expect us to trust those we've fought against for generations? How do you expect us to forget the bloodshed, the betrayals, the scars we carry?" Kofi met the elder's gaze without flinching. "I don't expect you to forget," he said calmly. "But I do expect you to remember what we are fighting for. Our ancestors fought for our right to exist, to be free. They didn't fight to see us divided, torn apart by old grudges. We are more than the sum of our pasts. We are the future." Amina stepped closer to Kofi, her expression softening. "We may have our differences, but those differences make us stronger. We are not just tribes, we are a people, and we will stand together or we will fall alone." The elder stared at them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he nodded. "I will stand with you," he said quietly. "For our people, for our future." One by one the other leaders began to rise, some slowly, others with conviction. The resistance was beginning to come together, their differences melting away in the face of a common enemy. It was not perfect, it was not without friction, but it was progress. Kofi felt a wave of relief wash over him as the last of the leaders pledged their support. This was a turning point, a moment that would define the future. But even as they celebrated this victory, Kofi knew the real battle was ahead of them. They had united the tribes, but now they had to fight for what they had worked so hard to preserve. The Queen wouldn't go down without a fight, and neither would they. "Now we prepare," Kofi said, his voice filled with determination. "We fight for everything, for our families, for our history, and for our future." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kofi allowed himself a small smile. They had taken the first step, and together they would take the next. The days blurred together in a frenzy of activity. Kofi and the newly united tribes worked tirelessly, preparing for the battle that would determine their future. They had gathered weapons, forged alliances, and fortified their defenses, but Kofi knew that their strength didn't lie in their armaments alone. It was in their unity, in the heart of every person standing together against the overwhelming force of the Queen's army. The air felt thick with anticipation as the resistance assembled, their spirits high despite the overwhelming odds they faced. Kofi walked through the makeshift camp, taking in the sight of warriors from all walks of life preparing for the fight ahead. Some were sharpening their blades, others were meditating, seeking inner strength for the battle. The young, the old, men and women alike, were ready to lay down their lives if it meant protecting the future of their people. Amina stood by his side as they surveyed the camp. "They're ready," she said quietly, her voice filled with pride. Kofi nodded, though his mind was still racing. "We have no choice but to be ready. Everything we've fought for, everything we've built. It all comes down to this. We can't afford to fail." She glanced at him, sensing the weight on his shoulders. "You're not alone in this, Kofi. We all have something to fight for. Together we'll win." The sound of drums echoed from the distance, a rhythm that was both a call to battle and a reminder of their heritage. It had become their battle cry, a reminder that they weren't just fighting for survival, but for the preservation of their identity, their culture, their history. Kofi felt the energy of the camp rise with the drums, a powerful reminder of the strength they carried in their bones. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kofi stood alone at the edge of the camp, the weight of the sword in his hand, a constant reminder of what was at stake. The sky above was painted in deep hues of orange and purple, the calm before the storm. He could feel the earth beneath him, solid and unyielding, as if it were grounding him, offering him the strength to face what was ahead. Thinking about the battle. Amina's voice broke the silence, and Kofi turned to see her approaching, her face serious but compassionate. Kofi let out a long breath. "I keep wondering if we're truly ready. This feels bigger than anything we've faced before." "The Queen, her army, it's hard to imagine how we can win." Amina stepped beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon. "You've been training for this your whole life. Your father prepared you, and now it's your time. We all believe in you, Kofi. You're the one who can lead us." He shook his head, the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. "I never asked for this. I never asked to be the leader, to be the one everyone looks to, but now it's all on me." Amina placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a quiet reassurance. "You don't have to carry it all alone. We're in this together. And when we win, it will be because we fought as one." Kofi turned to her, a determined look in his eyes. "I know. But it's still hard to shake the feeling that this is all too much to lose." She smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in days. "Sometimes, the weight of leadership feels unbearable, but the most important thing you can do is trust the people around you. Trust that you're not carrying this alone." As night settled over the camp, the sound of voices and the rhythm of the drums filled the air. Kofi knew that this would be their final night of preparation. Tomorrow, they would face the Queen's forces, and there would be no turning back. The resistance gathered for their final meeting, the air thick with determination. Kofi stood before them, the weight of his ancestors' strength fueling him. "We've prepared," Kofi began, his voice strong, echoing across the gathered tribes. "But now it's time to show the Queen what we're truly made of. She thinks she can break us, that we're nothing. But we're more than that. We are the sum of our history, our struggles, and our victories. We are unbreakable. Tomorrow we fight not just for survival, but for the future of our people. Together we will stand and we will win." The tribes raised their voices in unison, a wave of energy and resolve sweeping through them. Kofi could feel it, the collective power of their unity. It was time to fight, and nothing could stop them now. The first light of dawn broke through the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. The camp had quieted in the hours before the battle. Kofi stood at the edge of the gathering, his gaze fixed on the vast field ahead. It felt surreal, this moment. This was the moment he had prepared for, but it was also the moment where everything could end. The resistance was ready, but their strength was not just in their weapons or numbers. It was in the fire that burned inside each one of them. Kofi could feel it, that collective pulse of determination and defiance. Today, they would either defeat the Queen or die fighting for the future they believed in. Amina approached him, her face set with a quiet resolve. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his face. Kofi nodded, though the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavy on his shoulders. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, his voice steady but filled with the gravity of the moment. "You've led us this far," Amina said, her voice warm despite the tension in the air. "And we trust you." Kofi looked at her, grateful for her presence, but there was something in his chest that made it hard to breathe. This was no longer just about leading an army. It was about leading people who had placed their lives in his hands. They weren't just warriors, they were his family, his. "Whatever happens today," he said, his voice low but filled with meaning, "it's because of all of you that we've made it this far. I'll fight until the end, but we're in this together." Amina smiled, her eyes filled with an unspoken understanding. "We always have been." As the battle preparations continued, Kofi found himself surrounded by the warriors from the United Tribes. Each one of them had come from a different background, but today they were one. They had no time for divisions. They were fighting for their history, for their future, and for each other. The ground beneath them rumbled, and the Queen's army could be seen approaching from the distance. Their ships darkened the sky, casting a shadow over the land. The sheer scale of the Queen's forces was overwhelming, an endless line of soldiers, machines, and alien technology, a stark reminder of how powerful their enemy was. Kofi's breath caught in his throat, but he pushed the fear aside. They had already fought so many battles, internal and external, and they had come this far. The Queen may have thought they were weak, but today she would learn the truth. The drums of war sounded, their steady beat carrying across the battlefield. The resistance raised their weapons high, a unified roar echoing across the plains. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their right to exist, to preserve the essence of who they were. Kofi raised the sword, the ancient weapon in his hand, feeling its power surge through him. It wasn't just metal. It was a symbol of their defiance, a connection to the strength of their ancestors. With every swing, with every move, Kofi would carry their legacy forward. The Queen's forces began to advance, their technology and sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the resistance. But Kofi didn't flinch. He had seen fear before, he had lived through it. Now there was nothing left to fear, this was their moment. "Hold the line!" Kofi shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The resistance braced themselves, their feet planted firmly in the earth, ready to face the oncoming storm. The clash was inevitable. The first strike came with a deafening roar as the two forces collided. The ground shook with the impact of battle, and the sounds of weapons clashing filled the air. Kofi fought with everything he had, his movements sharp and precise, fueled by the power of the sword and the strength of his people. Amina fought by his side, her speed and skill a perfect complement to his strength. Together, they cut through the Queen's forces, carving a path toward the heart of the battlefield. But the Queen's army was vast, and her presence loomed over them like a dark cloud. Kofi could feel the weight of her gaze, as if she were watching, waiting for him to falter. But he couldn't afford to falter, not now. The battle raged on, and with every swing of his sword, Kofi reminded himself why he was fighting. For his people, for his ancestors, for every voice that had ever been silenced. They were fighting for something greater than just victory. They were fighting for their right to exist, to preserve the culture and history that had shaped them. As the tide of battle shifted, Kofi felt a surge of hope rise within him. They weren't just surviving, they were winning. The Queen's forces were faltering, their morale slipping as the resistance fought with relentless determination. Kofi glanced at Amina, her face smeared with dirt and sweat, but her eyes still filled with the fire of their shared mission. They were almost there. The Queen's defeat was within reach, and with that thought, Kofi charged forward, the sword raised high, ready to strike the final blow. The battle was at its peak, and the world seemed to fade into a blur of chaos. The sky above, once clear, was now filled with smoke and the distant sound of explosions. The ground shook with the weight of the ongoing fight, the cries of warriors rising and falling like a constant wave. Kofi's breath was heavy, each movement a blur of instinct and sheer will. He had never known a battle like this, fierce, relentless, and with no guarantees of survival. But through it all, Kofi's focus remained unbroken. The Queen's forces had pushed hard, but the resistance had shown them something they hadn't expected. Humanity's resilience. Kofi's sword flashed in the air, the ancient weapon now a symbol of defiance, cutting through enemy soldiers with a precision that came from deep within him. He fought not for himself but for the future of his people, for the preservation of everything they held dear. His heart was in his chest, thundering with each strike. Every movement was fueled by the memories of those who had fought before him, and by the faces of the men, women, and children who would suffer if the Queen succeeded. The weight of his people's future hung on every decision he made. The Queen's voice rang out across the battlefield, mocking and cold. You cannot win. You are all fools thinking you can resist what has already been decided. Kofi's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the sword. He could hear her, but it no longer mattered. The battle was shifting, and he could feel it in the air. The resistance was pushing back. For every soldier that fell, another rose to take their place. For every strike, a roar of defiance followed. It was as if the entire world was standing with them. He moved swiftly, dodging blasts and weaving through the chaos, until he found himself at the heart of the enemy's forces. There, standing atop a platform of metal and smoke, was the Queen, her eyes cold and calculating, as though the death of thousands meant nothing to her. Kofi's breath caught in his throat as he faced her. She was powerful. This was undeniable. Her presence alone sent a wave of unease through the ranks of the resistance. But Kofi knew deep in his bones that this fight wasn't just about strength, it was about heart, about what each person was willing to sacrifice to protect their future. How think you can defeat me with your puny resistance? The Queen sneered, her voice cutting through the noise of battle. You are nothing. You've already lost. No, Kofi said, his voice strong despite the exhaustion that weighed on him. We've already won. The Queen laughed, the sound shrill and cold. She raised her hand and the ground trembled beneath Kofi's feet. The sky darkened as her forces surged forward, and for a moment it seemed as though all hope was lost. But in that moment Kofi saw something, a flicker of light in the distance. His people were still fighting, his ancestors were still guiding him. And in his heart he knew what he had to do. Kofi's eyes met Amina's across the battlefield. She was surrounded by enemies, but her eyes locked with his, and in that brief exchange they both understood what needed to happen. She nodded, a solemn understanding passing between them. This battle, this war, it would require the ultimate sacrifice. Kofi turned back toward the Queen, the sword now raised high above his head. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop, to wait, to find another way. But the way forward was clear. The Queen could not be allowed to win. For everything his people had fought for the future of humanity, Kofi knew that the only way to defeat her was to face her head-on, to make a sacrifice that would change everything. With one final, determined breath, Kofi surged forward, charging through the chaos toward the Queen. The sword was a blur of motion in his hands, and for the first time in his life, Kofi felt the full weight of the weapon's power. The blade was more than a symbol. It was the culmination of everything he had fought for, everything his people had suffered through. As he reached the Queen, their eyes locked, and for a brief moment there was no sound, no movement, only the intensity of the moment. And then, with all his strength, Kofi brought the sword down. The clash was deafening. And then, silence. Kofi fell to his knees, his breath ragged. The sword was no longer in his hands, the energy from the strike leaving him weakened. But as he looked up, he saw the Queen falter. She staggered, her once imposing form now crumbling. Her forces were beginning to retreat. The tide of the battle was turning. Kofi closed his eyes for a moment, knowing that his sacrifice had made the difference. His people, his family, his history, they had all fought for this moment, and it had been enough. As he collapsed to the ground, he felt a sense of peace. The battle was over. The Queen had been defeated. Humanity had won. Kofi's world was fading into darkness. His body felt heavy, the weight of exhaustion and the consequences of his actions pulling him down. But in the back of his mind there was a sense of relief. The battle was over. The Queen's forces were in retreat, her reign broken by the very hands she had thought so weak. His hands. His vision blurred, but he could still hear the sounds of victory ringing through the battlefield, the chants of his people, the cries of warriors who had fought and survived, their spirits unbroken. It was a sound that reverberated through his soul. Humanity had won, but the cost had been high. Kofi had given everything, and now he had to let go. Amina's voice cut through the haze of his thoughts. "Kofi, stay with me. You've done it. We've done it." He opened his eyes, seeing her standing above him, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, but her eyes shining with something deeper, pride, relief, and unspoken gratitude. She knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder, trying to shake him awake. "You're a hero," she said softly, but there was no celebration in her voice, only a deep sadness that mirrored his own. "You've saved us." Kofi's chest rose and fell with labored breaths, his strength draining. "It's not just me, it's all of us, everyone who fought." Amina nodded, her hand brushing his hair back. "They'll sing of your bravery for generations to come, Kofi. You've given us a future." But even as the words of praise were spoken, Kofi knew the truth. Victory had come at a great cost. The future they now had was one built on the sacrifices of countless lives, his own included. And while the Queen was defeated, the scars of war would remain forever etched in their hearts and minds. As Kofi's vision began to darken again, he heard footsteps approaching. Strong hands lifted him, carefully but firmly, and he was carried to where the leaders of the tribes had gathered, their faces solemn yet filled with reverence. The moment they had fought for had arrived, but it was not a moment of triumph, it was a moment of remembrance. The tribe leaders gathered around him, their eyes reflecting the gravity of what they had just endured. The battle had been won, but it was clear they understood the true price of that victory. The sword that had once seemed an impossible challenge was now a symbol of everything they had fought for, a symbol of their resilience, their culture, and their future. Kofi was laid on a makeshift platform, the cheers of his people growing distant as he struggled to stay conscious. The elders stood above him, their voices low as they spoke words of honor, but Kofi could barely make out the meaning. The words felt like a distant memory, fading in and out, replaced by a deep sense of peace. He had done what was needed. His people would live, they would thrive. That was enough. Amina, standing close by, held his hand as tears filled her eyes. "You did it, Kofi. You saved us all. You brought us together." Kofi's lips moved, but his voice was barely a whisper. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. All of us together." His eyes searched hers, trying to convey everything he couldn't say. "Rest now," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You've earned it." As the crowd of warriors, families, and leaders gathered around him, their voices rising in song, Kofi closed his eyes, feeling a deep connection to every soul present. The song of his people, the song of survival, echoed in his heart, a reminder that though the battle was over, the fight for their identity, their culture, would never truly end. It was a battle that would be passed down through generations, and Kofi had secured their future. The stars above shone brightly, as though the universe itself was watching over them, honoring their struggle and their triumph. Kofi's journey had come to an end, but the legacy of his sacrifice, the legacy of every warrior who fought beside him, would live on. And in the quiet of that moment, Kofi knew that humanity had not just survived, they had won. The days after the battle were a blur of mourning, healing, and rebuilding. Kofi had sacrificed everything, his body, his life, to ensure that humanity could continue, but in doing so he had become more than just a man. He had become a symbol, a legacy that would live on through every person who had fought beside him and for every person who would come after them. His name would be spoken for generations, etched into the hearts of those who had been spared by his courage. Amina stood at the edge of the camp, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the remnants of the battlefield. The war was over, but the scars, physical and emotional, remained. There was no going back to the way things had been before. But there was a new hope now, a new beginning that Kofi had fought for. The tribes, once divided by mistrust and centuries of history, had begun to rebuild their connections. What Kofi had dreamed of, unity, was slowly becoming a reality. But there was something missing, something Kofi had left behind that Amina knew would always be a part of this new world, his spirit, his will to fight for the future of humanity. As the wind swept through the camp, Amina closed her eyes, remembering the final moments with Kofi. His words, his strength, the way he had never given up, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. She could still hear his voice in her mind, his final words before he fell. "We fight for each other." She knew those words would live on forever. It was the reason the resistance had succeeded. It was the reason they had stood together. But now she was left with the weight of continuing the fight without him. "His legacy is our future," Amina whispered to herself, more to the wind than to anyone in particular. "And we will honor him by living it." As the leaders of the tribes gathered to discuss the future of their newly unified world, the pain of Kofi's loss still hung heavy in the air. There was a deep respect for what they had accomplished, but also a realization that their work had only just begun. The Queen had been defeated, but the universe had not forgotten them. There were other threats, other dangers, lurking in the dark corners of space. They had to be ready, for they were no longer just survivors, they were the torchbearers of a new era. Amina stood before the council, her voice strong and steady, as she spoke to those who had once been reluctant to join their cause. "We are not just a resistance anymore," Amina began, her eyes sweeping over the faces of the leaders. "We are a nation built on unity, on courage, and on the shared sacrifices of those who came before us. We will honor Kofi's legacy by never allowing the darkness to consume us again." The room fell silent. Each leader had seen the power of Kofi's vision. Each had felt the strength of his leadership, his determination to bring their people together. And now, they were ready to follow through. They would not fail him. Amina paused, allowing her words to sink in. "We have rebuilt what was broken. We are stronger now, not just because of what Kofi gave, but because of what we have all given. This is our future, and it is one that we will protect together." Her words were met with nods of agreement, the room coming alive with renewed energy. They were no longer just fighting to survive. They were building something new, something enduring. A future that Kofi had dreamed of, and that now they would carry forward step by step. As Amina stepped away from the council, she stood in the middle of the camp, surrounded by those who had stood with Kofi. The evening sky stretched above her, a canvas of stars that seemed to speak of endless possibilities. She could almost hear Kofi's voice in the wind, whispering that this was just the beginning. And so she stood tall, ready to face whatever came next. She wasn't alone. None of them were. The future was theirs to shape, and they would do so with the legacy of Kofi as their guiding light. Months passed since the battle, and the world had begun to heal. The once war-torn cities now showed signs of renewal. Buildings were rebuilt, crops were planted, and children once again played in the streets. But the changes ran deeper than just the physical recovery. Humanity had been reborn, united in a way that no one had thought possible before the Queen's invasion. What had once been a fragmented species, divided by history and mistrust, now stood together as one. Amina stood atop a hill overlooking the new settlement. The air was crisp, the scent of fresh earth and growing plants filling her lungs. It was hard to believe how far they had come. The resistance had not just fought against an alien threat, they had fought against their own limitations, their own fears, and they had succeeded. The sky was clear, the sun shining down on the people below. There was a sense of peace now, a quiet that hadn't existed before. But Amina knew that peace was fragile. It always was. She had seen too many battles in her life to think otherwise. Yet this time she had hope. The world had come together, and humanity had proven that they could overcome even the greatest of challenges. Her thoughts drifted back to Kofi. He had given everything, his life, to ensure that the future would be bright. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his absence in her heart. He had been more than just a leader. He had been a symbol, the embodiment of everything that humanity could be. His sacrifice had not been in vain. His legacy lived on in every person who stood tall, united in purpose. The future wasn't guaranteed. There were always risks, always threats lurking in the distance. But now there was a foundation built on trust, unity, and the belief that together humanity could achieve anything. Amina was determined to ensure that Kofi's vision would never fade. She had promised him that they would not only survive, but thrive, and she would keep that promise no matter the cost. The leaders of the tribes had come together, forming a new council, and together they began to rebuild a world that was inclusive, where every voice mattered. The ancient traditions of their people were honored, but they had also embraced new ideas. The future was a blend of the old and the new, forged through sacrifice, resilience, and the shared desire to never repeat the mistakes of the past. Amina walked through the settlement, greeted by smiles and waves from those she passed. The faces were familiar, filled with a sense of pride and purpose. She had seen so many of them grow stronger through the war, each one carrying the weight of their struggle, but refusing to let it define them. They were building something lasting, something that would endure for generations to come. She stopped at a memorial, a statue of Kofi standing tall, his sword raised high, a reminder of his sacrifice and the victory he had led them to. People gathered around it, offering their respects. Amina stood there for a moment, her heart heavy with gratitude and loss. Kofi was gone, but his spirit remained. It was in every person who carried his memory, in every person who fought for the future. "There is still much to do," Amina said softly to herself, "but we've come a long way." As she turned and walked toward the horizon, a new day beginning, she knew that the battle was over. But the work was just beginning. It would take time, effort, and patience. But humanity had shown that they were capable of extraordinary things. Together, they had defeated the Queen. Together, they would build a future, the future Kofi had fought for.